On the edge of memory, there lies a night that should have been private, sacred, and tender. The wedding night. A union whispered between two hearts, a threshold where two lives met in silence. Yet in the villages of medieval Europe, this threshold was never just theirs. It was a stage. It was a trial. It was a spectacle for every whispering mouth, every suspicious eye, every soul waiting in the dark for proof that love was pure. Imagine a young bride standing beneath the heavy timbered beams of her new home. Her hands tremble, not from desire, but from dread. She knows the truth. Her body is not her own tonight. Her body is a contract, a currency, a mirror in which the entire village will search for honor, blood, and certainty. The groom may take her hand, but behind the closed door, 100 unseen faces lean forward in expectation. This is not intimacy, it is judgment. And judgment wears the mask of ritual. What kind of world demands that love be proven in pain? What kind of community gathers in the shadows to weigh a woman's worth against the redness of a sheet? The silence of those nights still echoes. It is not the silence of peace, but the silence of surveillance, a silence thicker than breath, heavier than stone, where a bride's heartbeat is louder than her voice. In that suffocating stillness, she realizes she has become less a person than an emblem. Her trembling body is expected to testify on behalf of her lineage, her family's honor, her community's pride. And one mistake, one moment of silence, could unravel everything. The obsession with purity was not born of love, but of fear. Fear that lineage might falter. Fear that bloodlines might be stained. Fear that property, inheritance, and power might slip from the hands of men if the bodies of women were not caged, measured, and exposed. So purity became theater, and the bed became a courtroom. The bride lay upon its wooden frame like an offering upon an altar, her breath swallowed by the weight of eyes she could not see, but could feel pressing in from every wall. And when the ritual began, time itself seemed to hold its breath. Somewhere, in some village, a priest muttered prayers outside the chamber door, sanctifying the act not as love, but as evidence. Somewhere, an elder waited with the patience of a crow, ready to examine cloth and skin as though divinity itself demanded inspection. And the bride, a child of flesh and soul, was stripped of selfhood so that she might become a vessel of proof. This was not the celebration of union. It was the dissection of innocence. She may have whispered prayers to herself, but none of them could drown out the weight of tradition or the generations of women who had endured the same silent theater before her. Why is it that humanity has so often mistaken control for morality? Why do we weave cruelty into the fabric of sacred nights and call it tradition? Perhaps because tradition hides the cruelty beneath the word necessary. Necessary for order. Necessary for honor. Necessary for God. And yet, in the stillness of those nights, what God could have listened to the weeping breath of the bride and not turned away in sorrow? In the chronicles of forgotten villages, we find stories that read more like tragedies than marriages. There are accounts of feasts that did not begin until a sheet was displayed, a sheet that bore the crimson mark of proof. There are stories of silence when that mark did not appear, and of consequences too dark to name: annulments, exile, even death. Imagine the terror of that moment, not for love unfulfilled, but for a life that might be cut short by the absence of a single drop of blood. History whispers these truths in fragments, but each fragment carries the weight of 1,000 unshed tears. The ritual was not merely an event. It was a performance, an ancient drama where the audience was the village itself, and the stage was the bedchamber. Every man, woman, and child became participant, their honor tied to what they did not see but demanded to know. The bride and groom became actors in a script older than their own names, their roles carved into them by laws, by customs, by fear. And yet, even within the shadows of this cruel ritual, there flickered questions that haunt us still. Was the sheet truly proof? Could blood alone measure loyalty, faith, or love? Or was the ritual itself nothing more than a mirror, reflecting back the insecurities of a society afraid of its own fragility? These nights were not born in isolation. They were the children of centuries of belief, woven by the threads of law, religion, and gossip. They thrived on silence, on submission, on the unspoken knowledge that resistance meant ruin. And so the ritual lived, not because it was holy, but because fear is fertile soil. Fear grows roots deeper than reason, and once planted in the heart of a community, it can twist even love into spectacle. Consider the way these traditions echoed through neighboring regions. In Spain, noble houses bound brides with contracts that demanded public proof of virginity, their dynasties hanging upon that fragile veil of flesh. In France, chronicles speak of villages where the bride's chamber was entered not only by her husband but by his family, who demanded to be witnesses to her body's so-called truth. In Germany, songs and plays mocked women who failed to bleed correctly, turning shame into entertainment. Each region thought itself unique, yet each carried the same hunger, the hunger to possess, to control, to turn love into ledger and intimacy into inventory. Philosophers of later centuries looked back at these customs with unease. What they saw was not morality, but fear disguised as virtue. The obsession with purity was less about the sanctity of the soul and more about the ownership of flesh. A woman's body was a sealed chest, and the community demanded the key. And if the lock appeared already broken, then the entire house of honor collapsed. What a fragile foundation to build a society upon. One night, one sheet, one body. But we must pause here and consider the human heart that beats beneath these rituals. The bride was not only a symbol. She was a person, with memories of childhood, with dreams whispered in the dark. She may have loved the man beside her, or perhaps she barely knew him. She may have carried hopes of tenderness, laughter, children of her own. Yet the ritual transformed her hope into dread. Her first night of union became the first night of surveillance. Love was postponed, replaced by the urgent demand for evidence. And the groom? He too was caught in the snare of expectation. His role was not only to love, but to perform. He was told that his honor depended upon his ability to break his wife's body in such a way that it bled. How many grooms trembled, not from passion, but from terror of failure? How many were haunted by the knowledge that the entire village waited for proof of their conquest? In this ritual, no one was free. Both bride and groom were bound by the invisible chains of tradition, forced into roles neither had chosen. To see the cruelty of this ritual is also to recognize its reflection in our own times. For the obsession with purity has not vanished. It has only changed its mask. In some places, virginity tests are still performed, cloaked in the language of medicine. In others, gossip and rumor still ruin lives, echoing the voices of those medieval villagers who whispered outside bedroom doors. The stage may look different, but the play continues. As the candles flickered in those medieval homes, as villagers feasted or frowned depending on the color of a cloth, the world was teaching itself a lesson it never seemed to unlearn. That intimacy could be claimed by the crowd, that love could be stolen by law, that the body could be transformed into a battlefield where honor rose or fell. And as long as communities believed in the necessity of these rituals, no couple could ever claim their night as their own. So we return to that chamber, to the bride trembling beneath the beams, to the groom hesitating at her side. Outside, the village waits, breathing as one. Inside, two young lives prepare to be consumed by the fire of expectation. And as the night deepens, we are left with the question that will guide us through the shadows of this story. What does it mean to love, when love itself is forced to bleed beneath the gaze of an entire village? The ritual we have entered is not an accident of history. It did not appear suddenly, nor was it born from love. It was cultivated patiently, deliberately, by centuries of obsession with purity, with lineage, with the imagined cleanliness of blood. To understand how an entire village could gather in silence outside a bride's chamber, we must walk deeper into the soil of the past, where religion, superstition, and law braided themselves into a rope strong enough to bind generations. Purity was more than a personal virtue in the medieval world. It was currency. A family's honor was not written in deeds but in the state of a daughter's body. Her virginity was her dowry, her guarantee, her passport into marriage. Without it, she was a liability, a living scandal, a danger to the flow of inheritance. And so the testing of purity became as necessary as the signing of contracts. The ritual of inspection was not a grotesque curiosity to them. It was order itself, the invisible thread that kept families, villages, even kingdoms from unraveling. But beneath the doctrine of purity lay a darker truth: control. The body of the bride became the fortress wall protecting a family's bloodline. To breach it was treason, and to guard it was duty. The language of love was silenced, replaced with the language of surveillance. And when the community watched, it believed itself holy. Yet holiness was often nothing more than fear given sacred robes. In France, some chronicles speak of noble households where the presence of purity was negotiated like a treaty. The marriage could not proceed without guarantees, and if suspicion arose, the ritual of inspection followed. In rural Spain, there are records of village feasts postponed until the proof of honor was displayed for all. The same pattern emerges again and again. Intimacy postponed until evidence was produced. It was never about tenderness, it was always about display. Why blood? Why this obsession with a single physical sign? Because blood was the symbol that everyone could see. It was the theater of certainty, a visible mark that silenced gossip, at least for a night. Yet even this symbol was fragile, unreliable. Not every bride bled. Not every body fit the rigid expectations of purity. And when the crimson mark did not appear, fear became fury. Villages turned on brides. Families disowned daughters. Some women disappeared into convents, into exile, into silence so deep it became a grave. The absence of blood was never seen as nature. It was seen as betrayal. What strange cruelty is this, that a woman's life could be measured in droplets? What blindness, that intimacy could be reduced to a stain upon cloth? The ritual's logic was circular. If blood appeared, she was pure. If it did not, she was impure. No room for chance. No space for compassion. No thought that the human body might not obey the expectations of myth. It was not science. It was theater with fatal stakes. And yet, the obsession with purity was not limited to peasants and villages. Kings, queens, and dynasties were shackled by the same chains. Royal marriages were annulled on accusations of non-consummation. Wars broke from whispers that a bride was not untouched. The fate of empires trembled on the same fragile symbol as the fate of village brides. Purity was never just personal, it was political. It was law disguised as flesh. The church sanctified this obsession, embedding it into sermons, into confessions, into the prayers of fearful parents. Virginity was preached as holiness, as the mirror of the Virgin Mary herself. The closer a woman came to untouched perfection, the closer she was said to resemble heaven. Yet paradoxically, she was expected to surrender that perfection on command, to bleed on cue, to transform her sanctity into evidence. Holiness was demanded, and then holiness was stripped away. Consider the philosophy of this paradox. Women were honored as saints before marriage and judged as evidence after it. They could never remain untouched, for untouched women were useless to dynasties. They could never be truly free, for freedom carried the risk of gossip. They lived inside a paradox where the highest virtue was both demanded and destroyed. And so purity was not a gift, but a burden, an impossible standard whose weight crushed countless lives. In the eyes of the medieval world, this burden was not cruelty. It was seen as duty, as natural law. To them, the ritual of inspection was no different than measuring fields, weighing grain, or testing gold. A bride's body was property, and property must be tested before it was claimed. How chilling that the body could be treated as an object to be authenticated. And yet, in this very logic, we glimpse the heart of the obsession, the fear of loss, the terror of uncertainty. For in uncertain times, certainty becomes an idol, and idols demand sacrifice. The sacrifice, always, was human. The women who bore this burden were not myths or symbols to themselves. They were daughters who remembered laughter in their parents' houses, brides who once dreamed of affection, women whose hearts beat with the same rhythm as our own. They became victims not because they were weak, but because the entire system was designed to make their strength irrelevant. The ritual was larger than any single person. It was a tide, and no wave could resist the ocean. Yet in the silence of those chambers, did no one question? Did no groom ever pause and think, "Why must my love prove itself in blood?" Did no mother whisper to her daughter, "The ritual is unjust, but you must survive it"? History does not always record whispers, but whispers existed. Somewhere in the shadows, resistance flickered, subtle, fragile, often silenced, but real. The very fact that chronicles record failures, scandals, and moments of doubt proves that not everyone believed the ritual infallible. Suspicion was both its fuel and its flaw. Purity was less about the bride than it was about the community itself. The ritual reassured the village that its laws were working, its order intact. It reassured fathers that their wealth would not slip into the hands of strangers. It reassured grooms that their lineage was truly theirs. It reassured priests that their sermons had weight. And so the body of one woman became the theater of many men's insecurities. As we examine these rituals, we also examine the human hunger for control. For what is purity, if not an attempt to control time itself? The past must be certain. She must never have loved before. The present must be witnessed. She must bleed tonight. The future must be guaranteed. Her children must carry only his blood. The ritual of inspection was an attempt to lock past, present, and future into one moment of evidence. A moment so fragile, yet so heavily burdened, that it often broke the lives of those forced to bear it. The rituals of purity were cloaked in sacredness, but their shadows were dark with cruelty. They reveal a paradox of humanity. Our longing for certainty often drives us into cruelty. We demand proof where proof cannot exist. We demand clarity where life is clouded. We demand sacrifice to soothe our fear. And so the wedding night, which should have been the dawn of tenderness, became a night where fear triumphed over love, where bodies bore the weight of entire communities' doubts. The echoes of these rituals linger still. To study them is not to gaze into distant history. It is to look into a mirror. For though we may no longer gather outside chambers, though we may not demand bloodied sheets, the obsession with purity has not vanished. It lingers in whispered judgments, in cultural practices that still measure women by chastity, in courts where virginity tests are performed under sterile lights instead of candle flames. The stage is modern, but the script remains ancient. Segment by segment, we peel back the layers of this ritual. What we find is not only history, but the anatomy of fear. We discover how belief, law, and gossip could fuse into chains stronger than iron. And as we trace these roots, we prepare to step into the chamber itself, into the moment where ritual became reality, where intimacy was transformed into evidence, where love was asked to bleed for the sake of honor. The ritual now waits for us to enter its darkest chamber. We have circled its shadows, we have heard the whispers of its purpose, but now the door creaks open. Inside, the air is thick, the silence heavier than stone, and two figures stand at the center of a stage they never asked for. The bride and the groom. Behind them, unseen yet present, the eyes of an entire village press against the wooden walls. It is not their night alone. It never was. It is a night claimed by custom, by fear, by the hunger for proof. The public bedchamber has opened. Picture the room. The chamber is small, often just a single space in a timbered house. A bed draped in coarse linen, its sheets already washed by anticipation. Candles burn low, their flames restless, shadows bending across the walls like silent witnesses. At the door, elders may linger, priests may murmur prayers, guards or family members may stand as if guarding not only the bodies within, but the very order of the community outside. The chamber becomes a courtroom, and the bed its central evidence table. The bride and groom, stripped of privacy, stripped of choice, are reduced to actors forced to perform under the crushing gaze of the invisible crowd. The ritual begins with silence. A silence so tense it is nearly alive, trembling in the air like a taut string ready to snap. The groom, bound by duty, approaches the bride. He may love her, he may fear her, he may barely know her name, but none of that matters. His task is simple in command, yet impossible in weight. He must break her body into evidence. The bride trembles. She knows that her breath, her movements, her very heartbeat are being measured by ears outside. The slightest sound will travel into gossip. The slightest delay will be judged. The ritual has already stripped her of selfhood. She has become a vessel of expectation. What kind of love can survive such a stage? What kind of union can blossom beneath such suffocating eyes? The answer, often, is none. What should have been tenderness curdles into terror. What should have been affection transforms into performance. The intimacy of flesh becomes a trial. The rhythm of breath becomes testimony. And when pain comes, if blood comes, it is not received with compassion but with relief, as if a debt has been paid, as if the village itself has been purified. Accounts from medieval chronicles describe the eerie choreography of these nights. In some villages, the groom's family would remain just outside the door, listening for proof, waiting to seize the cloth. In others, the priest himself would stand watch, demanding the evidence of blood as if God required verification of flesh. There are even darker tales, where elders, neighbors, sometimes entire groups forced themselves into the chamber itself, demanding to see with their own eyes. The bride's body was not only tested, it was invaded by custom. Her fear was not only private, it was shared as spectacle. Imagine the weight of that moment. A young woman, barely beyond childhood, pressed into a ritual where her body's most intimate moment became a trial for survival. She may not even understand her own body fully, yet it was demanded of her that she perform flawlessly for the sake of honor. Failure meant ruin. Silence meant suspicion. And suspicion meant punishment too brutal to name. The bed, which should have been a place of warmth, became colder than any dungeon. The sheets, which should have been comfort, became sharper than any blade. But even success was no salvation. To bleed was to satisfy the crowd, but it was also to surrender innocence under force. The village feasted while she wept. The sheet was displayed like a trophy, the proof paraded as though love were livestock tested in the marketplace. Men drank wine. Women whispered blessings. Children learned that blood was honor. And in that moment, the bride's pain was erased from the story, replaced by celebration. She ceased to exist as herself. She became a symbol, and symbols cannot cry. Yet not all rituals went smoothly. Some brides did not bleed. Some sheets remained unstained. In those moments, terror hung thicker than smoke. Explanations were demanded. The groom might be blamed, his manhood questioned, his family shamed. The bride might be accused of betrayal, of secret sin, of carrying another's love into the bed. Elders interrogated, families argued, priests condemned. The absence of blood, though natural to many, was treated as a crime. Punishments ranged from annulment to exile, and in some darker tales, to death. One night, one sheet, one chance. The cruelty of the ritual lay not only in its demand, but in its unforgiving finality. We must pause and ask, what was truly being tested here? Was it virginity, or was it obedience? Was it purity, or was it submission? For the ritual was never really about truth, it was about control. The bride's body became the stage upon which a community reassured itself of order. The groom's performance became the seal that laws were working, that families were secure, that inheritance was protected. The ritual was not about love, it was about fear disguised as proof. There are echoes of this ritual across cultures. In some regions of Eastern Europe, sheets were hung from windows so the entire street might see. In Mediterranean villages, feasts waited for the cloth to be displayed in the center of the gathering. In northern lands, priests carried the sheet to the church as holy evidence. Each variation carried the same essence. Intimacy converted into theater, the body reduced to evidence, the night transformed into spectacle. The public bedchamber was not one village's cruelty, it was humanity's shared shadow. Philosophically, the ritual forces us to confront a deeper question. Why do societies so often take what is private and make it public? Why do we strip love of its mystery, its sacredness, and demand that it bow before law and crowd? Perhaps because mystery frightens us. Perhaps because love, in its freedom, is too unpredictable, too uncontrollable. And so societies build cages for love, rituals that chain it, spectacles that display it, as if to say, nothing escapes our gaze. Even your most intimate breath belongs to us. The bride and groom, trapped within the ritual, became symbols of this paradox. He was forced to prove his strength, she was forced to prove her purity, and both were crushed by the burden of expectation. The village believed it was defending morality, yet in truth, it was dismantling love. It claimed to preserve honor, yet in truth, it was manufacturing shame. And shame, once planted, takes root deeper than compassion. Somewhere in those chambers, a bride may have wept silently into the darkness, her tears soaking the sheets that would later be inspected. Somewhere, a groom may have hesitated, torn between the duty demanded of him and the tenderness he wished to give. Somewhere, a village may have cheered at the sight of blood, never realizing it was cheering the breaking of a soul. History records fragments, but the silences between them speak louder. The silences of women unnamed, of grooms unremembered, of nights that became scars across generations. And yet, the ritual endured, century after century. Why? Because fear is contagious, and once a community believes that its survival depends on proof, no individual can stand against it. To refuse the ritual was to risk isolation. To resist was to invite suspicion. And so the cycle continued. Brides trembled, grooms performed, villages watched, and love was buried beneath the weight of custom. The public bedchamber is not easy to look at. It unsettles us, it angers us, it wounds us. But to look away is to allow its shadow to linger unchallenged. We must step into that chamber not as voyeurs, but as witnesses. Witnesses who acknowledge the cruelty, who honor the silence of those who suffered, who understand that the ritual was not about love, but about control. Only then can we begin to unravel its power. For now, the curtain falls on this act of the story, but the echoes of the bedchamber remain. They will follow us into the next segment, where the ritual's demand for blood becomes the centerpiece of the drama, where the sheet itself becomes the most powerful symbol of purity and shame. The story does not end here, it deepens. And with every step, we move closer to the heart of the ritual, where honor, cruelty, and fear meet in the color red. Blood has always carried weight in human imagination. It is life itself, the river of being, the substance that cannot be replaced. To shed blood is to wound, to spill blood is to kill, and to guard blood is to protect existence. But in the medieval bedchamber, blood became something stranger. It became a verdict. A single drop, no more than the sting of a thorn might draw, was asked to carry the burden of honor, morality, and destiny. The sheet beneath the bride was no longer cloth. It was a canvas upon which the future of families, the pride of men, and the whispers of villages would be painted. And what it demanded was proof in red. Picture the moment. The ritual ends, the room still heavy with silence, and all eyes turn toward the cloth. In darker tales, punishment was fatal. Accusations of infidelity spiraled into violence, into execution, into graves unmarked. All because the body did not conform to the story the community demanded. Think of the terror in that moment for the bride. She may have been innocent, untouched, virtuous by every measure of faith. Yet if her body did not bleed, she was guilty in the eyes of the village. Imagine her heartbeat as the cloth was examined, her breath frozen, her entire existence balanced on fibers of linen. No court of law, no appeal, no mercy, only the verdict of a sheet. How could love blossom in such soil? How could joy grow in such cruelty? The ritual made tenderness irrelevant, turned innocence into accusation, and demanded pain as the price of honor. The bloodstained sheet became a symbol larger than itself. It was not only proof of virginity, it was proof of obedience, of submission, of the willingness of a bride to sacrifice herself for her family's name. It was less about her truth and more about their control. By displaying the sheet, the village declared, "We are secure, our daughters are chaste, our families are honorable." It was theater, yes, but it was also propaganda. A symbol carried through generations, teaching children that purity was proof, and proof was blood. Consider the feast that followed. If the sheet was red, the tables filled with laughter, songs were sung, and cups overflowed. The bride, often silent, sat among the celebration like a relic, honored but erased, praised but voiceless. The sheet is lifted, examined, held to the dim light of candles. Sometimes it was displayed only to family elders, sometimes to priests, sometimes to the entire village assembled for a feast. A mark of crimson was greeted with relief, with cheers, with toasts to honor and fertility. For a single stain meant that purity was intact, that honor was preserved, that fear had been conquered by proof. In those nights, the future of dynasties rested not on treaties or armies, but on the fragile evidence of blood. But what if the cloth remained pale? What if the sheet told no tale of rupture, no evidence of pain? Then silence descended like a blade. Murmurs spread, eyes sharpened, suspicion swelled like a storm cloud. The absence of blood was never understood as possibility. It was treated as betrayal. A bride could plead, a groom could defend, but once the cloth failed to testify, the ritual turned from celebration to inquisition. Families clashed, priests condemned, gossip roared through the village like fire through dry thatch, all from the absence of a single stain. The cruelty lies not only in the demand, but in the ignorance. For not every body bleeds. Not every bride carries the expected sign. Nature itself defies such rigid laws, but tradition was deaf to biology. The myth of blood was stronger than truth, and so women were sacrificed to its illusion. Some were cast out, their marriages annulled, their futures severed. Some were shamed until silence consumed them. The groom was lifted on shoulders, congratulated as though he had conquered not only his wife, but fate itself. And the village feasted, convinced that its order had been reaffirmed. All joy built upon a girl's wound, upon the breaking of flesh, turned into festival. But if the sheet remained white, the feast soured. Whispers curled through the air like smoke. Faces darkened, silence grew heavy, and joy turned to suspicion. In some accounts, the feast was canceled altogether. The celebration collapsed into quarrels, accusations, and shame. Families divided, alliances broke, futures dissolved. The absence of blood carried the power of ruin. And for the bride, there was no escape. Her innocence, her truth, her very soul was irrelevant against the tyranny of the sheet. Why this obsession with visible proof? Because gossip is a fire that demands fuel, and without evidence, suspicion becomes uncontrollable. The village needed something it could see, something it could touch, something it could hold aloft as shield against doubt. Blood was tangible, undeniable, a mark that silenced rumors. Without it, words would spiral, trust would collapse, and fear would grow. And so the body of the bride was forced to provide what the community lacked: certainty. Yet certainty built on suffering is never truth, it is only illusion. Across Europe, variations of this ritual emerged, but all carried the same demand. In some regions, midwives were brought to inspect the sheets, their hands turning from healers into judges. In others, priests blessed the cloth, as though sanctifying pain as holy. In certain villages, the sheets were displayed on church doors, the bride's private body transformed into public scripture. And always, the message was the same. Blood was proof, and without it, life unraveled. The theater repeated across centuries, its cruelty preserved by the very people it destroyed. What does this tell us about the nature of tradition? That we cling to symbols not because they are true, but because they make us feel safe. A community built upon fragile fears will demand evidence even when evidence is impossible. It will prefer cruelty over uncertainty, pain over doubt, blood over silence. And in this, we see the paradox of humanity. Our longing for certainty so often makes us blind to compassion. We worship proof while ignoring truth. We celebrate evidence while silencing innocence. We turn blood into scripture and forget that behind it is a living soul. The sheet itself became an artifact of memory. Some were kept, preserved as family relics, stored away like sacred treasures. Others were paraded, displayed to neighbors, remembered in songs and gossip. And though the cloth was no more than fabric, it carried the weight of generations. A single thread could bind or break alliances. A single stain could raise or ruin dynasties. In the fragile fibers of linen, entire lives were judged. What madness! That love was reduced to cloth, that intimacy was transmuted into spectacle. The cruelty of the ritual rests not only in the moment of judgment, but in the permanence of its shadow. For even if the bride survived, even if she bled, even if the village celebrated, she would carry the memory forever. Her first night of intimacy was marked not by love, but by performance, not by tenderness, but by fear. She would remember the weight of eyes pressing from outside, the silence of judgment, the coldness of a sheet raised to the light. And that memory would linger, a scar invisible yet unhealed, carried quietly through the rest of her days. And so the ritual's demand for blood was more than tradition, it was indoctrination. It taught every child who watched, every neighbor who whispered, every family who feasted, that intimacy was not sacred, but public, that the body was not self, but symbol, that love was not free, but bound by law and proof. It turned generations into spectators of cruelty, each one ensuring that the next would repeat the play. The sheet became scripture, the stain became doctrine, and pain became the currency of honor. But shadows deepen as the story moves forward. For while the sheet was the centerpiece, it was not the end. The ritual did not end with display. It continued with judgment, with surveillance, with consequences that stretched far beyond the night itself. Blood was proof, but it was also the beginning of a lifelong sentence. In the next step of our journey, we follow the ritual as it moves beyond the chamber, into the streets, into the feast halls, into the courtrooms of power, where the bride's body became the theater of the entire village. And in that theater, every whisper carried the weight of law. The night of inspection was never truly private, even when walls separated the bride and groom from the village. For the ritual was designed not only to test the bride, but to feed the crowd. It was an event as much as a union, a spectacle as much as a sacrament. And once the cloth had been lifted, once the verdict of blood or silence had been delivered, the ritual spilled outward into the streets, into the feast, into the daily gossip of every villager. The wedding bed was not the end of the trial, it was only the beginning. The day that followed was the day of judgment. In the early hours, as the candles still guttered in their wax, the sheet would be carried out. Sometimes discreetly, sometimes with fanfare, sometimes paraded in the open as though it were a banner of war. And when it appeared, the village gathered. Faces leaned forward, eyes sharpened, whispers grew into thunder. A crimson mark was received with applause, with toasts, with relief that the community's honor was intact. The bride was declared pure, the groom victorious, the family secure. For one night, one ritual, one body had reaffirmed the order of the world. But the ritual did not end with celebration, it deepened into surveillance. The entire village became judge and jury, weighing every gesture, every silence, every detail of the couple's union. If the sheet bore blood, questions arose. How much blood? Was it enough to prove certainty? If it bore none, suspicion lingered like smoke. Even when proof appeared, doubts were whispered, secrets imagined, stories embellished. And so the ritual bound the couple not only in marriage, but in the endless scrutiny of the crowd. The feast that followed was both a celebration and a courtroom. In some regions, the newlyweds were expected to join the table immediately, their faces scrutinized for signs of passion or shame. Laughter masked interrogation, songs concealed gossip, and every villager believed themselves entitled to judge. The bride's silence was read as guilt, her nervousness as betrayal, her weariness as failure. The groom's confidence was measured, his pride dissected, his performance mocked or praised. What should have been a feast of joy became a theater of surveillance, where every eye was a witness, every tongue a verdict. We must pause and imagine the weight of this gaze. For surveillance does not need walls or guards. It thrives in whispers, in glances, in the suffocating knowledge that every action is seen. The bride and groom, who should have been free to discover one another in tenderness, were instead imprisoned by the eyes of their village. They were not two lovers, but two actors in a drama staged for the crowd. Their bodies had already been claimed by custom. Now their futures were claimed by gossip. Why do communities hunger for such spectacles? Perhaps because fear unites them. In uncertain times, people cling to rituals that make them feel secure, even if the cost is cruelty. The ritual of inspection reassured the village that order prevailed, that daughters were guarded, that families were honorable. It was not the truth they sought, but the feeling of certainty. And certainty, once demanded, cannot be satisfied by silence. It must be fed again and again, with gossip, with proof, with spectacle. Historical accounts describe the strange pageantry of these days of judgment. In some French villages, the bloodied sheet was nailed to the door of the couple's home, a public proclamation that purity had been defended. In parts of Spain, the sheet was paraded through the streets during the feast, carried like a relic before the laughter of the crowd. In Italy, songs were sung mocking brides who failed to bleed, their names immortalized in satire. In Germany, plays and farces reenacted the wedding night, turning the private pain of women into public entertainment. The ritual was not only a test, it was a performance, replayed endlessly until its cruelty became comedy, its violence became tradition. And when the verdict was failure, the spectacle grew darker. Villagers whispered of betrayal, elders spoke of annulments, priests preached of sin. The bride's family was shamed, their honor questioned, their alliances weakened. The groom's family demanded restitution, their anger burning hotter than any hearth. The village itself turned into a courtroom, and the bride stood accused without defense. Innocence did not matter. Biology did not matter. Silence was guilt, and gossip was law. What does this tell us about the nature of surveillance? That once a community decides it owns the truth, no individual can escape. The bride's body was claimed not only by her husband, but by her neighbors, her priest, her family, her children yet unborn. Her life was no longer her own. It belonged to the crowd. And the crowd is never merciful. The crowd hungers, and hunger grows. Today it demands blood, tomorrow obedience, the next day silence. A bride may pass the test, but the surveillance never ends. The paradox is cruel. The ritual claimed to protect honor, yet it destroyed intimacy. It claimed to preserve morality, yet it bred cruelty. It claimed to unite communities, yet it divided families with suspicion. It claimed to guard love, yet it poisoned it with fear. What kind of love can survive when every kiss is shadowed by the gaze of neighbors, when every silence is judged, when every night is haunted by the memory of Judgment Day? The ritual bound not only bodies but souls, tethering them to the endless hunger of the crowd. We must remember that not all communities were identical. Some practiced the ritual with fervor, others with discretion, some with cruelty, others with uneasy reluctance. But the essence remained. Love was made public, intimacy stolen, lives bound by the theater of proof. Across Europe, across centuries, the same hunger repeated itself, the hunger to turn private bodies into public evidence, to feed the crowd with certainty even at the cost of compassion. Consider the psychological weight this carried into every marriage. A groom, praised for his conquest, may feel pride, but beneath it lay the terror of failure, the fear that whispers might one day turn against him. A bride, shamed or celebrated, carried scars that no feast could heal. Even in success, she had learned that her body was not her own, that her value lay not in her soul, her laughter, her wisdom, but in a cloth stained red. The ritual taught not love but fear, not tenderness but obedience, not intimacy but surveillance. And these lessons lingered long after the feast was over. The Day of Judgment was not a single day. It stretched into years, into lifetimes. For once a community learns to claim a body as its evidence, it does not let go. The bride lived with the knowledge that she had been watched, that she could be judged again, that her children, her actions, her silences would all be measured against the same standard. The ritual was not only a night. It was a sentence, a chain carried invisibly, a shadow that never faded. And so the ritual's cruelty grows clearer. It was never just about blood, never just about proof, never just about one night. It was about power. It was about communities claiming ownership over individuals, families binding their honor to flesh, priests sanctifying fear as holy. The bride was not only a woman. She was a vessel of collective insecurity. The groom was not only a man. He was a performer forced to prove his role. The village was not only a community. It was a jury that demanded evidence before it allowed life to proceed. And in this cruel theater, love itself was the greatest casualty. The echoes of this theater have not disappeared. They linger in the way societies still watch, still whisper, still claim ownership of intimacy. They linger in practices that demand proof, in cultures that measure honor in silence, in courts that treat bodies as evidence. The public bedchamber may have faded, but the hunger for surveillance remains. And unless we confront its shadow, it will continue to haunt us. The sheet has been lifted, the feast has ended, but the ritual moves forward. Its next act takes us deeper into the hearts of the couple themselves, into the terror, the silence, the unbearable weight of expectation that lay between desire and duty. For beyond the surveillance of the crowd lies a more intimate cruelty, the destruction of tenderness itself. And to understand that, we must enter the minds of those who endured it. I have expanded this voiceover to 16,102 characters, within your target 15,000 to 18,000. This segment descends into the psychological terror of the ritual, where intimacy was erased by expectation, where desire collided with fear, and where both bride and groom became prisoners of performance. Between the dim candlelight and the silent crowd outside, the wedding bed was transformed into something more than furniture, more than ritual. It became the battlefield where desire and terror collided. The groom, who may have dreamed of tenderness, entered the chamber carrying the burden of generations. The bride, who may have longed for gentleness, found herself reduced to a vessel of proof. And in that fragile space where love should have been born, both found themselves stripped of humanity, their hearts caged by fear. This was not union. It was spectacle. Not intimacy, but performance. Not freedom, but surveillance disguised as tradition. Imagine the moment when the door closed. The groom looks into the eyes of the woman he has married, but those eyes are not his alone to see. Behind them lies the weight of her family, her neighbors, her priest, the expectations of every whispering tongue in the village. He is not only her husband, he is her examiner, her judge, the executor of a ritual older than either of them. And she, trembling in silence, knows that her body is not a sanctuary but a courtroom. Her breath is testimony, her pain is evidence, her silence is guilt. Together, they are bound not by love but by the crushing hands of expectation. What does fear do to the human heart? It distorts it. It takes tenderness and hardens it into obligation. It takes passion and freezes it into performance. The groom may wish to comfort her, but comfort is irrelevant. He may wish to be gentle, but gentleness risks failure. He may love her, but love is silenced by the demand for blood. He is told that his honor depends not on his devotion, but on his ability to wound. He must conquer, he must break, he must produce evidence. And so, in that chamber, he too becomes a victim, not of her, not of himself, but of the ritual that demands cruelty in place of affection. And what of the bride? Her terror cannot be overstated. She enters her wedding night not with anticipation but with dread, knowing that her body is no longer hers. Every part of her is under scrutiny, even when unseen. Her innocence is not enough. She must prove it, publicly, physically, painfully. She must bleed for her family, bleed for her husband, bleed for the village. And if she does not, she will be cast into shame. In that moment, desire is not only impossible, it is unthinkable. Her body becomes a cage, her soul a prisoner. Love is postponed indefinitely, perhaps forever. Consider the strange paradox of this ritual. Two people, expected to begin a life together, are instead placed in opposition. He must wound, she must endure. He must prove, she must submit. He is told his honor rests upon her blood. She is told her future rests upon his conquest. The ritual turns marriage into a battlefield where both are soldiers, but neither can win. For even if the ritual succeeds, tenderness is lost. The victory is hollow, built upon pain, leaving behind scars invisible but enduring. What intimacy can grow in soil watered with fear? Historical accounts speak of grooms who faltered, unable to fulfill the ritual. They were mocked, shamed, accused of weakness. Some were ridiculed as less than men, their families dishonored, their names whispered with contempt. Others were pitted, cast as victims of a wife who was secretly impure. In either case, the groom was not free. His life too was chained to the ritual. He could not love freely, could not fail without consequence, could not exist outside the expectations of the crowd. He was as much a prisoner as the bride, though his chains were gilded with the illusion of power. And yet, the bride bore the heavier burden, for her failure was never excused. If blood did not appear, suspicion always turned toward her. No matter her innocence, no matter her truth, her body's silence was red as guilt. Some brides tried to trick the ritual, staining sheets with animal blood, with herbs, with careful deceptions. Some succeeded, escaping shame at least for a time. Others were discovered, punished with exile, with violence, with death. Deception itself became evidence of impurity, feeding the cycle of fear. And so even resistance became dangerous, proof of guilt rather than survival. Philosophically, we must ask, what happens to love when it is forced into performance? Love is fragile, delicate, born in trust and nurtured in freedom. But when love is caged, when it is forced to bleed on command, it dies. What remains is not affection but obligation, not desire but fear, not intimacy but ritual. The couple, instead of discovering one another, discover only the cruelty of tradition. Their marriage begins not with tenderness but with a wound, not with laughter but with silence. And silence, once planted, grows into a forest of distance that no feast can disguise. The psychological scars of these nights must have been immense. The bride carried the memory of fear into every day that followed. The groom carried the memory of pressure, of obligation, of performance. Together, they shared a secret that was not theirs alone. The village had already claimed it. Every smile was shadowed, every glance weighed, every silence judged. Their love, whatever shape it might have taken, was stolen before it could be born. The ritual had already claimed it, turned it into evidence, buried it beneath cloth and gossip. This cruelty was not unique to one place. Across Europe, across centuries, we find echoes of the same ritual, the same hunger for proof, the same psychological scars. In some regions, witnesses literally stood inside the chamber, watching, ensuring the act was consummated. In others, neighbors pressed their ears to the door, listening for sounds, waiting for evidence. In still others, the sheet was displayed publicly while the couple sat in silence, forced to endure the gaze of hundreds. Always, always, the same terror, the same surveillance, the same destruction of tenderness. And yet, even within this cruelty, we glimpse small moments of defiance. Some grooms refused to participate, protecting their brides, shielding them from the ritual's violence. Some brides resisted silently, withholding blood, enduring shame rather than submission. Some communities whispered doubts, questioning the fairness of the ritual, wondering if proof demanded in pain was proof at all. These moments did not break the cycle, but they reveal that not all hearts were hardened, that compassion flickered even in the darkest chambers. And perhaps, in those flickers, we see the seeds of resistance that would one day grow. But resistance was rare, and fear remained the law. For fear is a powerful ruler. Fear tells the groom that his manhood depends on cruelty. Fear tells the bride that her survival depends on pain. Fear tells the village that its honor depends on evidence. Fear weaves itself into ritual, disguises itself as tradition, cloaks itself in sacred robes. And once fear wears the mask of holiness, who dares to tear it away? The ritual endured not because it was just, but because it was feared. And fear, once planted, can outlive generations. The tragedy is that love, the one thing the ritual claimed to celebrate, was the very thing it destroyed. For what is love without trust? What is love without freedom? What is love if it must bleed to be believed? The ritual twisted intimacy into obligation, desire into duty, tenderness into terror. And in doing so, it taught entire communities that cruelty was acceptable, even necessary, if it preserved order. It taught them that surveillance was safety, that pain was proof, that love was secondary to fear. And once a lesson is taught in blood, it is not easily unlearned. The echoes of these lessons linger still. In modern times, purity tests are performed under the guise of medicine. Courts demand evidence of chastity. Cultures measure honor by silence. The stage may look different, but the performance continues. And until we confront its shadow, the ritual will never truly die. It will haunt our whispers, our judgments, our laws, our expectations. For the ghost of the ritual is not bound to the past. It walks beside us, reminding us of how easily love can be caged. The chamber has revealed its terror, the bed has shown its cruelty, and the couple has endured the weight of expectation. But the ritual does not end there. Its shadow stretches outward, into the fabric of law, into the halls of kings, into the sermons of priests. For the ritual was not only psychological, it was political, legal, religious. To understand its full power, we must leave the chamber and step into the courts, into the churches, into the dynasties that built entire futures upon the fragile evidence of blood. And there, in the next act, the ritual will grow darker still. The ritual seemed unbreakable. For centuries, it endured like stone, carved into law, guarded by priests, sanctified by fear. Yet even the strongest walls show cracks. Even the heaviest chains rust. And in the chronicles of history, we glimpse rare but powerful moments where the ritual faltered, moments when brides resisted, when grooms refused, when villages were scandalized by defiance. These are not stories of triumph, for resistance came at terrible cost. But they are stories that remind us that even in the darkest traditions, the human spirit sometimes whispers no. Imagine a bride who refuses to bleed. She enters the chamber knowing what is expected, knowing the price of silence, and yet she resists. Perhaps she denies her groom. Perhaps she defies the ritual. Perhaps she chooses shame over surrender. History records few such names, for their voices were buried, their fates too often tragic. Some were cast out, banished from their villages, sent to convents or cloisters where silence swallowed them whole. Others were punished more brutally, their resistance taken as proof of guilt, their bodies broken by violence. Yet even in failure, their refusal is a kind of victory, a whisper against centuries of obedience. And what of grooms? Some resisted too. Chronicles tell of men who loved their wives enough to shield them from cruelty, who refused to display the sheet, who rejected the village's demand for proof. Some claimed the evidence existed, even when it did not, protecting their wives with lies that silenced suspicion. Others barred the door, standing between their brides and the crowd, daring the village to judge them both. These acts of defiance were dangerous, for a groom who protected his wife risked his own honor, his own family's standing, even his own safety. But still, some chose compassion over custom, love over fear. Their names too are often lost, yet their choices echo through the silence of history. Communities themselves sometimes faltered. Not all villagers celebrated cruelty with equal fervor. Some looked upon the ritual with unease, their laughter hollow, their cheers subdued. Some whispered doubts. Is this truly holy? Does honor truly demand blood? These whispers were dangerous, for to question the ritual was to question the very order of society. Yet they existed. And in their existence, we see that the ritual was never as absolute as it pretended to be. Doubt, even unspoken, is a seed. And seeds, given time, break stone. One of the most striking cracks appears in the records of royal marriages. For if a king or noble failed to consummate his union, the ritual collapsed spectacularly. Courts debated, priests argued, dynasties trembled. The absence of proof was no longer a private scandal. It became a political crisis. Annulments were declared, wars erupted, succession lines faltered. In these moments, the fragility of the ritual was exposed. If blood was proof, and proof was absent, then the entire structure of power risked crumbling. And so, exceptions were invented, excuses made, evidence fabricated. The ritual, unbreakable for peasants, suddenly bent for kings. And in this hypocrisy, its weakness was revealed. But perhaps the most haunting cracks are found not in resistance, but in failure. For sometimes, the ritual simply could not be fulfilled. A groom, terrified or unable, faltered. A bride, too frightened or unwilling, resisted. The sheet remained white, the feast soured, the village murmured. In those moments, the ritual collapsed under its own weight. Families were shamed, marriages dissolved, lives ruined. The ritual had promised certainty, but it delivered chaos. And yet, instead of questioning the cruelty of the demand, communities doubled down, punishing the victims rather than the tradition. The cracks were there, but they were plastered over with fear. Still, cracks matter. They remind us that no tradition, however brutal, is absolute. They remind us that within even the darkest chambers, some hearts resisted. A bride's silence, a groom's shield, a villager's doubt, all small, fragile gestures, yet gestures of humanity against the machinery of fear. These moments may not have ended the ritual, but they reveal its vulnerability. For if even one couple resisted, if even one family refused, then the ritual was not law but theater, dependent on obedience, vulnerable to defiance. Philosophically, these cracks force us to ask, what is tradition without compliance? It is nothing more than a ghost. The ritual lived not because it was sacred, but because people obeyed it. Once obedience falters, even slightly, the ritual reveals itself as illusion. And that is the paradox of cruelty. It appears eternal, but it survives only because fear feeds it. Remove fear, and it starves. Remove obedience, and it collapses. Every bride who resisted, Every groom who shielded, every villager who doubted, was a hand pulling at the threads of the ritual's fabric. And though the cloth held, it was never seamless again. In some folk tales, we find echoes of resistance disguised as stories. Tales of brides who outwitted their grooms, tales of grooms who chose mercy, tales of communities punished for cruelty. These stories may not be literal histories, but they reflect a truth. People longed for defiance, even if they could not live it. Folklore became a secret rebellion, a whisper passed from one generation to the next. This is cruel. This is unjust. This is not the only way. Folklore kept alive the dream that one day, love might triumph over fear. Yet resistance was rare, and its cost immense. For every whisper of defiance, there were 1,000 silences of submission. For every bride who resisted, 1,000 bled in silence. For every groom who shielded, 1,000 obeyed. The ritual endured because fear outweighed defiance, because the cost of resistance was too high. But even rare cracks matter. They are the reason we can tell this story now. They are the reason the ritual, though cruel, was never absolute. They are the reminder that even in the darkest times, humanity flickered. The ritual eventually weakened, though not because compassion triumphed. It weakened because societies changed. Laws shifted, dynasties fell, economies evolved. The obsession with blood lost some of its hold, though never completely. But before its power waned, it was defied in countless small ways, by countless unnamed souls whose choices left no record, but whose courage shook the foundations of fear. To tell their story is to honor the humanity hidden in the shadows. And so, as we leave this chapter, we carry with us the knowledge that cruelty is never total, that obedience is never absolute. The ritual appeared unbreakable, yet it cracked. It appeared eternal, yet it faltered. And in those cracks, we glimpsed the possibility of freedom. But the story is not finished. For even as resistance whispered, law and religion shouted louder, embedding the ritual deeper into the structures of power. To understand how the ritual survived so long, we must now step into the halls of kings and churches, where purity was not only a custom but a weapon, a tool of politics, and a verdict of God himself. The ritual of purity was not confined to the dim chambers of peasants or the gossip of villages. It stretched upward, into the palaces of kings, into the pulpits of churches, into the courts of law where parchment bore the weight of blood. What began as spectacle among villagers hardened into doctrine among rulers. The same sheet lifted in a cottage became the same evidence demanded in royal marriages. The same whispers outside a wooden door became the same accusations that echoed through cathedrals and castles. And in this ascent, the ritual grew sharper, for once law and religion embraced it, it became nearly impossible to escape. In the courts of medieval Europe, virginity and consummation were not private matters. They were political weapons. Dynasties could rise or fall on the accusation that a marriage had not been consummated. If no blood appeared, if no heir followed, the union itself could be declared void. Kings sought annulments, queens defended their honor, popes issued decrees, priests weighed in with solemn authority. The ritual was no longer the gossip of villagers, it was the judgment of nations. Entire wars were sparked by questions that began in the bedchamber. Had she bled? Had he performed? Had the union been sealed? Consider the case of royal annulments. A king might seek to rid himself of a wife by claiming the marriage was never consummated. The queen, humiliated, was forced to defend her body in public, to prove her innocence before clergy and court. Witnesses were called, physicians consulted, sheets examined, testimony weighed. The most intimate secrets of a queen became fodder for politics. Her body transformed into a stage where nations argued their futures. What began as ritual in villages became spectacle in courts, amplified to scale, where the fate of kingdoms balanced upon the same fragile evidence demanded of peasants. The church sanctified this intrusion. Virginity was not only a social expectation, it was a theological mandate. Priests preached that a woman's untouched body mirrored the purity of the Virgin Mary herself. Yet once married, that purity was expected to end in blood, as if holiness itself must rupture to prove its worth. The contradiction was never questioned. Instead, it was preached as divine order. The church claimed authority over the most private acts, declaring consummation not only necessary but sacred. Without it, marriages were invalid. Without it, families were illegitimate. Without it, salvation itself might falter. And so the ritual gained divine weight, its cruelty shielded by holy language. Lawmakers too codified purity. Legal texts recorded annulments, inheritance disputes, and accusations of infidelity, all tied to the question of consummation. Courts summoned women to testify, their voices trembling as they were forced to describe what no one should be forced to describe. Men were interrogated, shamed, or exonerated based on their ability to perform a ritual that should never have been anyone's business. The law transformed intimacy into evidence, love into contract, the bed into courtroom. In the parchment of medieval law, we see the same obsession that haunted villages, now stamped with royal seals. What kind of world places the most fragile of human acts under the heaviest of scrutiny? What kind of faith demands pain as proof of holiness? What kind of law declares love invalid without performance, without evidence, without surveillance? The medieval world answered, ours. And so the ritual endured, not because people loved it, but because power demanded it. Power always demands evidence, and power always disguises cruelty as necessity. The hypocrisy of this system becomes clear when we compare peasant and noble experiences. A village bride who failed to bleed was shamed, exiled, or worse. A queen who failed to conceive was interrogated, her reputation shredded in court, but sometimes protected by politics. Rules bent for kings, even as they broke women beneath them. In one case, a royal marriage dissolved when the groom claimed his wife was not intact. In another, a queen was accused of deception because her husband could not perform. In both, the women bore the weight of accusation, their bodies transformed into pawns on the chessboard of dynasties. The ritual's cruelty was universal, but its outcomes depended on power. Philosophically, the ritual's elevation into law and religion shows us the true heart of the obsession. It was never about truth, it was about control. When kings, priests, and lawmakers demand proof of intimacy, it is not intimacy they care about. It is inheritance, legitimacy, authority. They feared chaos, and so they demanded blood. They feared uncertainty, and so they demanded evidence. They feared freedom, and so they demanded submission. The ritual became the scaffolding of power, a way to regulate not only love but lineage, not only individuals but empires. The sheets of peasants and the parchments of kings told the same story, fear disguised as order. A crimson stain in a cottage silenced gossip. A crimson stain in a palace silenced courts. Both were illusions, both demanded suffering, both destroyed intimacy. And yet both endured, century after century, because power is always hungry, and fear is always fertile. Once law and religion blessed the ritual, it became more than custom. It became command. And commands are harder to resist than whispers. Still, cracks appeared even here. Some priests doubted the fairness of demanding proof in blood. Some lawmakers questioned the wisdom of annulments based on consummation. Some queens defended themselves fiercely, refusing to be reduced to sheets and gossip. These cracks did not end the ritual, but they revealed its fragility. Even in the halls of power, doubt flickered. For even kings and priests could not silence the truth forever, that love cannot be measured by wounds, that intimacy cannot be proved by blood, that humanity cannot be reduced to evidence. But the ritual endured nonetheless. It endured because power needs rituals to survive, because fear needs symbols to thrive, because societies cling to illusions even when they know they are cruel. And so the ritual lived on, embedded in sermons, in laws, in chronicles. It lived on in villages and palaces, in whispers and decrees. It lived on until the very idea of intimacy itself was scarred by surveillance. The cruelty of its endurance is clear. By binding purity to law and religion, the ritual ensured that even those who doubted could not escape. A bride may have resisted, a groom may have shielded, a villager may have whispered doubts, but once kings and priests demanded proof, resistance was nearly impossible. The ritual became larger than individuals, larger than communities. It became civilization's command. And in that command, humanity itself was diminished. But the story does not end here. For even as the ritual became law, it began to cast longer shadows. Shadows that stretched into centuries beyond the Middle Ages. Shadows that lingered in Victorian ideals, in modern texts, in cultural practices that still demand evidence of purity. To see the ritual's true power, we must follow its echoes beyond palaces and courts, into the modern age, where its ghost still walks beside us. The medieval ritual should have died with the age that birthed it. It should have been buried alongside the candles and parchments, the feasts and the gossip, the sermons that sanctified fear. And yet it endured, not always in the same form, not always with the same spectacle, but always with the same hunger, the demand that intimacy must prove itself to the crowd, that love must bleed before it can be believed. The shadow of the bedchamber stretched long, curling through centuries, shaping the lives of women and men far beyond the medieval world. What began as custom became legacy, haunting even those who thought themselves free of the past. In the Victorian age, purity took on new robes. The obsession with chastity became cloaked in propriety, in lace and etiquette, in books and sermons that preached the sanctity of untouched virtue. The bloodied sheet was no longer nailed to doors, but its ghost lingered in whispered expectations. A bride's worth was still measured in innocence, her body still scrutinized, her silence still demanded. Chastity belts, once the stuff of medieval rumor, became mythologized in stories of iron control. Doctors of the 19th century declared that a woman's moral health depended upon her virginity. Mothers whispered to daughters that their future rested upon their ability to appear untouched. The stage was different, but the script remained unchanged. Colonial powers carried this obsession into the lands they conquered. Laws were written that demanded purity tests. Trials were conducted where women were examined to prove innocence or guilt. In some cultures, the ritual was reshaped, fused with local traditions, yet always with the same essence: blood as proof, pain as necessity, silence as virtue. Colonizers claimed their laws were civilizing, yet in truth they exported cruelty, embedding it into the lives of women across continents. The sheet of medieval Europe became the courtroom of colonial empires, where women's bodies were interrogated under the guise of justice. And even as science advanced, the myth persisted. In the 20th century, so-called virginity tests were performed by physicians, cloaked in the authority of medicine. Courts accepted them as evidence. Families demanded them as proof, and women endured examinations that were little more than modern echoes of medieval inspections. Doctors measured hymens as if they were scales of morality, ignoring the truth that biology defies such simplicity. Women were shamed, marriages annulled, futures destroyed, all because the ghost of the ritual refused to die. The past was not gone. It was simply dressed in sterile gloves and white coats. Even today, in parts of the world, the shadow lingers. In some communities, virginity certificates are issued, demanded by families before marriages can proceed. In others, so-called two-finger tests are still performed, condemned by human rights groups, yet stubbornly alive in practice. Social media whispers of shame, gossip spreads like wildfire, reputations collapse in hours. The village has grown larger, global even, but the hunger for proof remains. Intimacy is still policed, love still surveilled, bodies still demanded to bleed. We no longer gather outside wooden doors, but the crowd is still there, its whispers amplified by new tools, its gaze sharper than ever. What does this persistence reveal about us? That fear, once planted, does not easily die. That societies cling to symbols of control even when those symbols are disproven, debunked, condemned. That the hunger for certainty, the need to cage intimacy, is stronger than compassion. The medieval ritual lives on not because people believe in its holiness, but because people fear what happens without it. Fear of betrayal, fear of gossip, fear of uncertainty. And so the ghost survives, wandering from century to century, changing shape but never leaving. Philosophically, this reveals something profound about humanity. We claim to value love, yet we fear it. We claim to cherish intimacy, yet we demand to own it. We claim to honor freedom, yet we bind it with rituals that turn bodies into evidence. The medieval ritual of purity testing was not only about the Middle Ages. It was about the human tendency to confuse control with morality, to mistake surveillance for safety. That tendency did not vanish with time. It adapted, disguised, resurfaced in new forms. It is still here, still alive, still demanding obedience. Consider the scars this shadow leaves on individuals. A young woman, entering her marriage today, may still feel the weight of expectation. She may not face a crowd outside her chamber, but she feels the invisible eyes of family, of society, of tradition. A young man may still be told that his honor depends upon conquest, that his worth lies not in tenderness but in proof. Together, they carry the same burdens as their medieval ancestors, though cloaked in different words. And though they may not know the ritual's history, they live its echo. For the past never truly dies. It whispers in the present, shaping lives silently, invisibly. The cruelty of this endurance is that it robs us of intimacy. For intimacy thrives in freedom, in trust, in tenderness. But when love must prove itself, when intimacy is demanded as evidence, it ceases to be intimacy at all. It becomes performance, obligation, ritual. And so, century after century, the ritual steals from humanity the very thing it claims to protect. It claims to guard love, but it destroys it. It claims to preserve honor, but it poisons it. It claims to ensure morality, but it manufactures cruelty. Its shadow corrupts every age it touches. Yet there is hope in recognizing the shadow. For once we name it, once we see it, once we trace its path from medieval chambers to modern courts, we can begin to dispel it. History teaches us not only what has been, but what must not continue. To confront the ritual is to confront fear itself, to demand that love be free, that intimacy belong only to those who share it, not to the crowd that seeks to own it. The ritual thrives in silence. It dies in recognition. And so by telling its story, by naming its cruelty, we weaken its hold. But before we reach conclusion, we must follow the ritual to its final chapter. For its story is not only one of history or survival, but one of meaning. What does it say about us that we have demanded blood as proof? What does it reveal about humanity's struggle between control and freedom, fear and love, cruelty and compassion? The ritual's shadow is long, but every shadow points to a source. And to see that source, to confront it fully, we must step into the final curtain of this story. There, in the last act, we will face the question that has lingered since the first night a sheet was lifted. What does it truly mean to love, when love has so often been forced to bleed? We have wandered through the chambers of history, walked among villagers pressing their ears to wooden doors, stood in palaces where kings demanded proof, and watched as priests lifted their hands to bless cruelty disguised as holiness. We have seen brides reduced to evidence, grooms to performers, intimacy to ritual. We have traced the sheet from cottage to cathedral, from feast table to courtroom, from medieval custom to modern echo. And now, as we arrive at the end of this journey, the question remains, what does it mean? What does this ritual reveal about humanity, about love, about the strange relationship between fear and power? It tells us that love, in the eyes of society, has too often been chained. Where it should have been free, it was burdened. Where it should have been intimate, it was made public. Where it should have been tender, it was forced to bleed. Humanity has long been unable to trust love as it is. We seek proof. We seek evidence. We seek rituals that reassure us, even when reassurance costs compassion. The medieval ritual was not about brides or grooms. It was about the fear of uncertainty. And that fear consumed intimacy itself. It tells us that the crowd is never satisfied. A crimson sheet silenced whispers for a night, but suspicion returned the next morning. A bride may have passed the test, but her life remained shadowed by the eyes of neighbors, by the endless hunger of gossip. A groom may have proven himself once, but he was still measured by performance, by heirs, by expectations. The ritual promised certainty, but certainty never came. What it created was an endless cycle of surveillance, where love was never safe, never private, never truly free. It tells us that cruelty often hides beneath the word necessary. The ritual endured because people believed it kept order. Families believed it protected honor. Priests believed it preserved holiness. Villagers believed it silenced gossip. Yet beneath every claim of necessity lay the same truth. Cruelty was chosen over compassion, fear over trust, ritual over love. Humanity convinced itself that suffering was proof of morality, when in truth, it was only proof of our own insecurity. What God, what law, what truth could demand pain as its evidence? And it tells us that intimacy has always been the battlefield of power. From peasants to queens, from villages to empires, the same demand echoed: prove yourself. A bride's body became the currency of inheritance, the guarantee of lineage, the evidence of contracts. Love was irrelevant, freedom impossible. What mattered was control. And in that control, entire civilizations revealed their fragility. For when power must rely on blood to prove itself, it is already weak. When love must be turned into evidence, it is already broken. But there is something else this story tells us, something quieter, yet more enduring. It tells us that cruelty, though heavy, is never absolute. The ritual appeared eternal, but it cracked. Brides resisted. Grooms shielded. Villagers whispered doubts. Queens defended themselves. Philosophers questioned. Doctors exposed the myth. Even in the darkest chambers, compassion flickered. Even in the loudest feasts, doubt whispered. Even in the harshest courts, truth lingered. The ritual survived for centuries, but it did not survive unchallenged. And in those cracks of defiance, we glimpse the enduring resilience of the human heart. So what does it mean, finally, to love? To love is not to perform. To love is not to bleed on command. To love is not to surrender to the gaze of the crowd. Love is not spectacle, not evidence, not ritual. Love is trust. Love is freedom. Love is the silence of two souls unobserved, untouched by judgment, unseen by crowds. Love is sacred precisely because it does not need proof. And when societies demand proof, they destroy the very thing they claim to protect. The medieval ritual is gone, but its shadow lingers. We no longer gather outside chambers, but we still whisper, we still judge, we still demand evidence. We measure bodies, demand certificates, perform tests, spread rumors. We may believe ourselves modern, enlightened, free of superstition. Yet the ghost remains, reminding us how easily intimacy can be stolen by fear, how quickly love can be caged by law, how often humanity chooses cruelty when confronted with uncertainty. To tell this story is not only to look backward, but to hold a mirror to ourselves. For the ritual may be history, but its essence is not gone. And so, at the end of this journey, we return to the beginning. A bride trembling beneath beams. A groom hesitating, torn between tenderness and duty. A village waiting, breathless, for proof. The silence heavier than stone, the gaze sharper than knives, the ritual demanding its evidence. We return to that night, but this time, we see it not only as history, but as warning. For every time we demand proof of love, every time we turn intimacy into spectacle, every time we cage freedom with fear, we repeat the ritual. The chamber may be gone, but the lesson remains. The lesson is simple, and it is this: love does not need to bleed. Love does not need to prove itself. Love is not evidence, but existence. It is sacred because it is free, not because it is controlled. If the ritual teaches us anything, it is that humanity must choose trust over fear, compassion over cruelty, freedom over surveillance. For only then can intimacy truly belong to those who share it, not to the crowd that waits outside the door. And so, as the candles fade, as the feast ends, as the sheet is lowered for the final time, we step out of the chamber and into the quiet. We leave behind the whispers, the judgments, the fears. We carry with us the memory of cruelty, but also the possibility of freedom. For love, even wounded, endures. And in that endurance lies hope, that one day, no one will ever again be asked to prove it in blood.